Welcome to the solutions to the second set of reading comprehension questions in the free LawPrep. You can attempt this free mock test by visiting the official website discoverlaw.in. The passage that we'd be dealing with in this video is a very interesting passage that talks about both the physical sciences as well as the social sciences. Typically in the LSAT India, you will have a problem that deals with the sciences. Let us go ahead and get acquainted with these kind of passages.
Here's what the question looks like when you actually attempt the free LawPrep mock. Let us first spend some time on the passage without looking at the questions. What you see here is the entire passage. I've just reorganized it for you for more clarity and better visibility. Okay, now I'm going to introduce a very important tip or a skill to you or a technique. The technique is that of skimming. Now, skimming basically means that you're going to very quickly look through the entire text. Okay. Now, what is the advantage of being able to read through something very quickly? Before that, let me tell you maybe how fast skimming is. When I ask you to skim, I'm kind of asking you to read this entire passage in around a minute or less, maybe just 30 seconds. Now, what do you think the advantage of skimming through something could be? Well, there are many advantages. First, I want you to understand that we are definitely in a position, given that we are human beings, to see a lot of things in just 30 seconds. If you glance through the passage in 30 seconds, you shall have gained many insights into the passage. For example, you'd know broadly as to what it is about. You'd kind of be able to identify that there's some kind of a debate or a conflict or some point in here. You can kind of get an idea of the structure, and all of this is very useful. Because now when you attempt reading the passage in a little detail, or maybe you may choose to look at the questions after this, this is not a brand new, fresh passage to you. You are acquainted. And when you're acquainted, you'd find that you're very comfortable. Okay? There are some techniques that you can use even in skimming. You see, the first paragraph, and in particular the first line, introduces the topic and the discussion or the debate to you. The last paragraph, and in particular maybe the last few lines, summarize that discussion for you. What you have in between are generally some points relating to the debate or the two sides of the debate. Okay, this is generally the structure that you'd find in most reading comprehension passages. So when you're skimming, pay particular attention to the first line of the first paragraph, the last line of the last paragraph. Likewise, when you're skimming through a certain paragraph, the first line of a paragraph gives you a lot of insight into what is going to happen in that paragraph, and the last line kind of summarizes that. So when you see the entire passage, pay attention to the first paragraph and the last paragraph in particular, because they tell you what the passage is about. When you're reading any particular paragraph, pay attention to the first line and the last line, and then quickly look through everything. Trust that even without wanting to, you will definitely learn something. Kind of think of it like this. When you glance through, say, a huge audience, maybe at a football field or at the metro station, you do realize that you've actually been able to see and process a lot of information. Let's take, for example, there's a friend of yours in the metro station, okay? And you quickly glance through the entire metro station. Don't you find your friend? Do you really go and look at every face in detail to find your friend? No, you just glance through and you find the thing that you need. Trust yourself that you can do something similar even here. Trust your ability to quickly glance through something and be able to comprehend something even then. And if you kind of think of it in terms of the ROI, right, in terms of what you get for the time that you spend, in 30 seconds, you know the passage at least to some extent. It is time very well spent. So what I'd say right now is to pause the video, give yourself 30 seconds, okay? Or maybe you can give yourself 45 seconds, but definitely not more than a minute at any cost, okay? Try to look at the 4 paragraphs here and give yourself a brief idea of what is contained in this. You don't need to explain this to anyone, it's just for your own self. I just want you to ensure that on the other side of 30 seconds or 45 seconds, and definitely not more than a minute, I want you to know that you know at least something about this passage. It's a great feeling as you now proceed. So pause the video, try it, and then we'll go ahead and look at this in a little more detail together. Okay, so now what we'll do is that we'll go through the passage 1 or 2 lines at a time so that you can see this passage in some detail. Starting with the first line, as I said, a very important line. It tells you that in recent years, the once unshakable confidence of scientists in the value of science has become somewhat less steady. What this tells you is that earlier there used to be an unshakable confidence of scientists in the value of science. However, in recent years, this unshakable confidence has become kind of less steady. Okay. And as you can see here in the following line, it talks about an element of uncertainty because of some problems, right? So you can see that there are some well publicized problems which has led to an undermining of this confidence, right? So essentially what you can see here that the value of science and its related research is being questioned, right? So you kind of understand the problem here. Earlier there was an unshakable confidence. Now it is kind of not that unshakable because there have been some problems, and you are now questioning as to how valuable science is. The first paragraph, the first few lines, the first and second line are laying down the entire problem for you. If you've been able to understand this, you can now find yourself in a position to anticipate what's going to happen next. Let us go ahead. Moving ahead, you can see that this sentence begins with, for example. Now, what do you think this is an example of? What is the example that is being given? You saw in the previous sentence that it talks about several problems, okay? And therefore, we'd expect that what you see ahead here is an example of a problem that has resulted in the uncertainty in the value of science. So let us go ahead and see it, okay? This is what is called active reading. You are actually engaging with the passage. You're not reading it mindlessly, that you just go ahead and just take your pointer and, for example, the discovery that is small. That's not how you do it. You engage with this. You think about it at every step. Okay. So what is the example? It says the discovery that a small number of scientists had falsified the results of their research engendered questions about the trustworthiness of scientific research in general. Now, what does this mean? It says that let's say there are many scientists. This is scientist number 1, scientist number 2, scientist number 3, scientist number 4, scientist number 5. Let's say there are many scientists, okay? Out of these, maybe 2 scientists, right? A few scientists, a small number of scientists falsified their own research. So maybe they were to say that, you know, the research is to go in this direction, but then they falsified their own research. So this casts some doubt definitely about their own research, but it says that it also engendered questions about the trustworthiness of scientific research in general. So because these 2 guys falsified, the whole of scientific research was now kind of seen with the lens of uncertainty. Okay. The next thing that you see as you go ahead is that and physicists have borne at least a modicum of blame for the fruits of their research, which means that, okay, in this case you're talking about research gone wrong. In the second case you're talking about the fruits of research, which means the results of research. Okay. As the peace movement of the last 2 decades increasingly publicized the horror of nuclear warfare. So what you see here is that some physicists, some scientists decided to do something on with nuclear science and nuclear physics, and what happened was that you made a bomb that creates this mushroom cloud, and you can destroy entire cities and nations. So this is also something that is causing people to question the value of science. So we saw here, first point, that the example is that some researchers falsified their own research. There were some others. Some physicists were held responsible and accountable for the undesirable results of their nuclear research, and therefore you can see that the value of science is being questioned. So we totally understand the problem by having read the first paragraph. Let us move ahead. Right, let's have a look at the highlighted part. It reads, a major consequence of these controversies, the controversies that you see here, is that scientists are now more concerned with what is called the responsibility of science. Whereas earlier their sense of responsibility was mostly limited to adhering to the scientific truth, the new sense of responsibility extends to considering the practical application of scientific knowledge. So what you're seeing is that now, right, when you can see time, you can see that now they're talking about the responsibility of science. Earlier, the responsibility of science was only restricted to their telling the scientific truth. What this means is, let's say, for example, let's say this is a microscope, maybe, okay, and now there's a scientist that is observing some specimen in here. Okay, so there's a scientist who is observing this. Okay, now earlier the responsibility of this scientist was that, let us say in this finding what actually is contained here is A. So he has to be truthful in saying that, hey, this is actually A. He must not say that it is B, right? So his responsibility from the earlier view was for him to be truthful. But now what they are saying is that the new sense of responsibility now is not just in the truth of the finding, but also to consider the practical application of this knowledge. So for example, let us say it was A, and he indeed says that it is A, but maybe this experiment had the risk of maybe this A is a dangerous virus, and if A could go out and it could cause a lot of problem, so then the scientist has to consider such things as well. What is the possible practical harm that could happen? This is seen as the new responsibility of science. Okay, so you're looking at the practical applicability as well. Moving ahead, let us look at this part now. Pause the video and you may try reading this by your own self. It says, some scientists joining their voices with those of certain philosophers, social scientists, and other experts on public affairs. Now, what does this mean? It says that some scientists along with these people, right, joining their voices. So scientists are joining these people in saying, to claim that scientists should exercise total control over the application of their discoveries. So as you could see, we were talking about application here, right? The application of scientific knowledge. So here it's saying that there should be total control over the application of their discoveries, and that they should not perform research that could have deleterious social consequences. It's quite obvious that deleterious has to mean bad, right? Some of these critics argue that scientists should not conduct research that will primarily serve the interests of the powerful and the wealthy. Other critics go even further to say that the science should serve only the interests of common people. Now you can see it talks of some people in here. Okay, so it first talks of some scientists along with some other experts who claim that scientists should exercise total control. It says some of these critics, so some out of these critics argue that they should not conduct research that serves the interests of only the powerful and the wealthy. And then it says other critics. So you can see that it talks about new critics, go even further to say that science should only serve the interests of the common people. So what do we see here? The claim is that scientists should have total control and not perform research that has bad possible consequences. The research should not serve mainly the rich, and that it should serve the common people. Okay, so these, as you can see, are some sort of recommendations. Let us go ahead. Let's look at this paragraph together now. It says, but before the recommendations of these critics to be realized, so we just saw that in here we had many recommendations. But before these recommendations can be realized, scientists would have to foresee the consequences of their research even before the results have been attained. And of course, scientists cannot make such prophecies. Furthermore, it is not reasonable to expect scientists to bear absolute responsibility for the applications of scientific research. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that scientists cannot be expected to foresee so much, okay? And therefore it's unreasonable for us to have absolute responsibility, to pin absolute responsibility on the scientists, okay? It says, to attempt to exercise such responsibility, scientists would have to take on the powers of legislators and civil servants, as well as the work of entrepreneurs, economists, and market researchers, all of whom share the task of determining whether the results of research are appropriate candidates for application, and if so, whether they could be applied safely, practically, and economically. So what is being said in this rather long line is that if you were to give absolute responsibility on the scientists, they would have to take on several roles, and all of these people here have a role to play in determining whether something is appropriate, safe, economical or not. So it says finally, as you can see the last line, right? The last line is generally a very good summary of what is told to you in the beginning of the paragraph. In fact, if you were to look at the first line and the last line, you'd find that the essence of it is conveyed pretty easily. It says, Look at the first line of this paragraph. But for the recommendation of these scientists to be realized, scientists would have to foresee the consequences of their research even before the results have been attained. Okay? And then it says, such roles lie beyond the training of scientists and beyond the legitimacy accorded to scientists by the society. Okay? It says that there's a limited role and responsibility of scientists. And the last paragraph, where we are likely to find the conclusion. As you can see here, it says, clearly then, scientists cannot assume total responsibility. So what we saw in the preceding paragraphs here was it lays down the debate of whether there can be total responsibility on the scientists or not. And here you can see the opinion of the author, which is that they cannot assume total responsibility. Such inveterate overseers as professional politicians would not yield their prerogatives to scientists. Now, this is a difficult line, okay? And I want you to find your way around difficult lines. What I can assure you is that not knowing the meanings of these words will really not hurt you. For example, let's see. Such dash dash as. So it's kind of, let's say you don't understand the meaning of this word. Let me just strike them out, okay? Let me show you a simple way of going about this. It's giving you an example, such dash dash as professional politicians. So it talks about a certain kind of people. So it's like saying such people as politicians. So you can just say, let's just strike this whole thing off. You can say some people, right? If you can just maybe replace this by, let's say, some, okay, politicians, or you can just simply say some. Some would not yield their prerogatives. Prerogatives means rights to scientists, and common sense would be violated. Scientists, like all other human beings, have not proven themselves sufficiently wise to justify such an arrogation of power. Right? So you're saying here that scientists have not proven themselves to be people who can take on so many roles, right? So they are just like other human beings. So what you can see here, even without bothering too much about the difficult words, is that scientists cannot assume absolute responsibility, because scientists are just like the others. They cannot play too many roles. They have a limited role, and we should give them a limited responsibility. Well, the main idea question. Pause the video and try solving this question by yourself. It's very important for you to be able to get the main idea questions right, because that's when you can really assess whether you've been able to comprehend the passage. Pause the video and try it by yourself. Okay, let's go for this together. Now, when you see a main idea question, remember that this should be general enough for it to consider what is stated in the entire passage. Also remember that you will find much of what is stated in the main idea question in the first line and the last line. And if you want to extend that a little further, then in the first few lines of the first paragraph and the last few lines of the last paragraph. Okay, these are the ones that will give you most of it, but you can also consider what is given in here. So let's see what we have in the paragraphs. The first paragraph tells you that the confidence in science has been shaken. What earlier used to be unshakable has now become a little less steady. Okay. What we see in this paragraph are the arguments that talk about pinning a lot of responsibility on scientists. Okay. We go ahead and see the next paragraph, which talks about the challenges if we had to pin all the responsibility on scientists. And then finally you see the conclusion of the author, where he says that you cannot have total responsibility on scientists. When you look at the options and you have to look for the option that kind of gives you all of these summed up, you'll find the answer. Again, if you've not already found your answer, pause the video and try it once again. I'll tell you the answer in a moment. Okay, so the answer is E. You can see here that you will find all of this. It says, although unprecedented doubts about scientific research have arisen both inside and outside, as you can see, you saw that it was not just scientists but also other kinds of people. Scientists cannot be expected to assume total responsibility. So just see, if you look at the first line and the last line, the first paragraph and the last paragraph, here you can see the first part which talks about doubts, and here in the second part you can see scientists cannot have total responsibility. I hope you realize how simple this is once you understand the technique. Look at the first paragraph, right? Look at the first paragraph, the first few lines, look at the last paragraph, last few lines, and you'll get the main idea question right immediately. Moving ahead, the second question for this passage, pause the video and try solving it by yourself. Right, so as you can see, the passage mentions civil servants here in the third paragraph as an example of a group engaged in which of the following activities. So it's asking you, what kind of activities are the civil servants engaged in? This is the question. Read the question once again. It says the passage mentions civil servants as an example of a group engaged in which one of the following activities. So you see 5 activities here. You have to choose as to what activities according to the passage the civil servants need to do. Now, it says to attempt to exercise such responsibility, scientists would have to take on the powers of these people, which means that what you would find behind this kind of tells you what the role of the civil servants is. So it tells you that it is not reasonable to expect scientists to bear absolute responsibility for the applications of scientific research. Aha. When you see this and then you look at the options, you can see that the answer emerges immediately, because you can see applications of scientific research and it says such responsibility. You have to be a civil servant. So what do civil servants do? They look at the applications of scientific research. Simple. Let's move ahead. Pause the video, solve the question yourself, and then we'll go ahead together. In a question such as this, if you were to start looking at the options, as you can see, the options are quite lengthy. So reading this is going to take some time. And you'd also find that the options are quite enticing. In such a scenario, by the time you've read the 5 options, you'd really lose sight of what you were looking for and where you're going. Therefore, in questions particularly such as this, but also in general for the questions in LSAT India, it's a very good option to first read the question statement, understand as to what the question requires of you, and then frame your own answer on the basis of the reading of the passage. Compose your own answer. Once you have an answer in your head, go and look for that in the options, okay, so that you know what you're looking for. If you don't frame the answer and you start reading these options, my God, that's going to be a really, really difficult task. Okay, so let's try to frame the answer after reading the question. The question reads, it can be inferred that the author of the passage would most probably agree with which one of the following statements about the assumption of responsibility for the application of scientific research. So it's asking you, what do you think the author would agree with? Which of these 5 options is something that the author is likely to agree with? Now, there's a word here, assumption of responsibility. Now, this word assumption is not used in the same sense as it is when you're studying logical reasoning. Assumption of responsibility means taking of responsibility, okay? So you assume responsibility, you can take responsibility. So just to let you know, to clarify, it's not used in the sense of the assumption that you see in the logical reasoning section. Okay. So basically we're looking for what the author thinks of. So on the basis of this passage, what do you think the author thinks, and what is he likely to agree with about the responsibility of the applications of scientific research? Who should take responsibility according to the author? So what we've seen here is that the author said that scientists cannot take all the responsibility because their role is limited, their education is limited, their training is limited, and there are other people who are competent, and therefore common sense requires that this decision should be taken collectively by a lot of people. So according to him, who takes the responsibility? Scientists and others. Okay, simply scientists alone cannot do it. Now once you've decided this and you look at the options one by one, I want you to take a minute or so to pick the right answer by yourself, and then we look at it together. Okay, so as you can see here, option B is your answer. Look at the other options and see as to why they are not okay. I've given you the hint here, and you can see that B is the answer. Next question, pause the video, try solving it by yourself. Which one of the following describes the function of the first sentence of the last paragraph? We've seen this already, that this is the conclusion. It starts with the word clearly, which is a very obvious indicator of the fact that it is telling you that there is a conclusion. C is the answer. Next question, pause the video, try solving it yourself. Right then, we'll look at the question statement, try to compose and frame the answer by ourselves, and then pick the option that resembles what we've thought of. Okay. So the question statement reads, the author of the passage suggests which one of the following about the critics currently calling for a change in the role that scientists play in their own research. Okay, the critics are calling for a role change, right? What is that role change? We see that they're saying that scientists should exercise total control, they should perform research that does not have bad consequences, they should not work for the wealthy, they should work for the common people, and all of this. And they're calling for a change. Now, what does the author of the passage say about that? What he says is here highlighted for you. He says that if these recommendations are to be realized, scientists would have to foresee the consequences of their research before the results, and scientists cannot make such prophecies. It goes on to also tell you that this decision is something that requires to be made collectively by numerous other stakeholders, and he goes on to say that clearly that scientists cannot assume responsibility. Pause the video and try to look for the answer by yourself. Okay, let's look at it together. It says scientists cannot foresee, cannot make prophecies, and therefore he says that critics do not understand that, hey, scientists have limited abilities. So when you tell scientists to take the entire responsibility, you are failing to recognize that they are like other human beings. They have limited education, limited understanding, limited training, and therefore they do not understand as to what the true capabilities and jurisdictions of the scientists are. Now, this is one of the very few questions in the LSAT India that requires you to have a little bit of a vocabulary with you, right? Even if you don't, you can still solve it, but it gets a little tricky. Try solving it by yourself. Do not consult the dictionary. Which one of the following, if substituted for the words an arrogation in the final sentence of the passage, would least change the meaning of the sentence? So you see arrogation of power here, and you are to see as to which one of these 5 options best replaces this. Okay, now let us understand that you can solve this question even without knowing the dictionary meaning of the word arrogation. In fact, you can even solve it without knowing any difficult word in here. That's generally how the questions are designed. Of course, having a good vocabulary will help you, but try solving it by yourself, trying to use maybe the method of elimination. Try to use your common sense. Let me tell you that if you use just your common sense and your ability to understand the simple words in the passage, you should be able to get this right. Pause the video and take a moment if you so wish. I'd like to give you the chance to do that. Okay, let's do this together. And what you can see here is that it is spoken of the fact that scientists have not proven themselves to be wise enough to have so much power, right? He's saying that, let's not give the scientists so much power. So maybe this could be like, hey, let's not give them so much power, let them not take so much power, let us not transfer them so much power. Okay. Now when you look at these phrases, transfer, giving, taking, and you look at the words in here, okay, a negation of power, no. A borrowing of power, well, it's not really a borrowing. It's like it's not being borrowed from anyone. And undermining, definitely not, because it's about giving and not taking. An abuse of power, well, the passage does not talk about abuse. In which case, even if you don't know the meaning of the word usurpation, you might be in a position to mark that as the answer. I know it's a little hard, it's too much to expect. But yeah, like I said, in this question, knowing a little bit of vocabulary helps. If you look at the dictionary meaning of the word usurpation, it'll be quite clear that this is the answer.